My husband works at the Supreme Court, I said, sipping my coffee as Karen waved a lawsuit in my face like she was a real judge. And trust me, you're about to learn exactly how bad you messed up. The expression on her face was the exact moment she realized she had gone after the wrong treehouse and the wrong woman. It started out as one of those perfect weekends you think only exist in commercials, the kind where the sun filters through the trees just right, and the only sound you hear is the laughter of kids playing outside. My husband Darren and I had been working for months on a surprise for our daughter Lily, a 2-story treehouse complete with a rope bridge, climbing wall, and even a little telescope turret. It was part jungle gym, part hideout, part fairy tale come to life. We'd hired a licensed builder and made sure everything was safe, solid, and well within our property lines. For Lily it was magic. For us it was joy. For Karen, it was apparently the apocalypse. We live in a gated community that has a homeowners association, which might sound like a good idea until you meet Karen, the HOA president who runs the neighborhood like a cross between a dictator and a middle school mean girl. Her hobbies include measuring grass blades with a ruler, issuing citations for unsightly trash bins, and, her favorite sport, finding reasons to harass families she doesn't like. We didn't even make it 48 hours after the grand treehouse unveiling before she showed up on our doorstep in her usual uniform, visor, clipboard, and a smirk you could spot from orbit. She didn't knock. She didn't ring. She just stood there, arms crossed, as though the sight of her was invitation enough. I opened the door and she immediately launched into a monologue so theatrical it could have earned her a daytime Emmy. According to Karen, the treehouse violated visual uniformity standards, exceeded the maximum height allowance by 1.5 inches, and most hilariously, was potentially a privacy threat to adjacent properties. Mind you, it faced nothing but trees and our own backyard. But in Karen's world, children playing equaled dangerous surveillance. I tried to keep my cool. I really did. But when she said we had 48 hours to remove it or face HOA fines and legal action, I had to bite the inside of my cheek not to laugh. She genuinely thought she was doing us a favor by offering to overlook the citation if we voluntarily dismantled the structure. I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "We'll take our chances." Her smile froze. That wasn't the answer she expected. She stormed off without another word, and I swear I saw her already drafting the lawsuit on her tablet before she reached the sidewalk. The next day, an envelope slid under our front door with all the drama of a villain's calling card. It was an official cease and desist from the HOA's attorney, complete with threats of a court summons, liens, and even language implying we could be held responsible for any injuries resulting from the treehouse, even to trespassers. It was over the top, laughable, and kind of terrifying. That's when Darren, who'd been quietly observing the madness, stood up, grabbed the envelope, and said, "Time to play the long game. Let me explain something about my husband. Darren is quiet, calm, and patient, qualities that make him an incredible Supreme Court clerk and an even better person to have on your side during a storm." While Karen and her little HOA army were flinging threats, Darren was already researching HOA bylaws, compiling every email we'd received, and scanning meeting minutes going back a decade. He didn't say much. He just worked, and when I asked him if we should call a lawyer, he just smiled and said, "Let's give them enough rope first." Meanwhile, I decided to play the public relations game. I invited over the parents of all the neighborhood kids who had been in love with the treehouse and showed them how safe and sturdy it was. I gave them lemonade, let their kids climb, and then casually dropped the news that Karen was trying to get it torn down. Their reactions were priceless. One dad laughed so hard he nearly dropped his drink. Another mom actually asked if she could write a character statement if it went to court. Support was already forming like a wave, and Karen, for all her bluster, had no idea it was coming. But then things escalated. Flyers started appearing around the neighborhood, warning residents that an illegal structure in the area posed risks of injury and devaluation of nearby homes. They weren't signed, but they reeked of Karen's desperate perfume and overuse of caps lock. One even had a blurry photo of our treehouse printed next to a stock image of a kid falling from a ladder. It was hilariously bad propaganda, but effective enough that a few nervous neighbors began asking questions. Darren suggested we play it cool and let Karen dig deeper. And oh boy did she. A week later, she filed a formal complaint with the HOA tribunal. Yes, that's a real thing, stating that we had willfully violated community statutes and that our defiance set a dangerous precedent. She attached aerial photos, taken from who knows where, and claimed our treehouse was a beacon of recklessness. I nearly spit my coffee when I read that line. Still, we didn't respond immediately. We let it simmer. Let her confidence peak. Let her think she'd won. Then one morning, I called an emergency HOA meeting. Karen was the first to show up, smug and ready. She brought a folder of documents and even wore a blazer. She strutted in like Judge Judy herself. But this time, we had our own arsenal. I walked in with Darren by my side and a thick binder under my arm. I let Karen speak first. She gave a long-winded speech about rules and discipline, throwing in words like egregious and irresponsible community behavior. The board nodded along until I took the floor. I calmly laid out our evidence. The permits, the licensed contractor details, the fact that the bylaws didn't say a single word about backyard recreational structures unless they were permanent residences. Then I pulled out the HOA handbook, the original, with Darren's sticky notes all over it, and showed the board how Karen had been making up rules, skipping votes, and hosting private sessions that weren't authorized by anyone. When I finished, I said, "You're not looking at a violation. You're looking at harassment." The room went silent. Karen looked stunned. Darren stood up, adjusted his tie, and added, "And if this goes further, we're prepared to take legal action." He pulled out his ID and placed it gently on the table. It read, "Clerk, United States Supreme Court." Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. No words came out. She sat down so fast the chair squeaked. And that's how the battle really began. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood had become a whispering hive of speculation. People walked their dogs slower past our house. Some waved more enthusiastically than usual, while others avoided eye contact like we'd erected a missile silo instead of a treehouse. But what they didn't know was that Darren had barely slept that night. While I had dozed off around midnight, he stayed up reading the HOA's own charter, squinting at paragraphs that hadn't seen daylight since the 90s. He found something at 3 in the morning that made him mutter, "This is better than I hoped." I'd never seen him look so gleeful reading legalese. By breakfast, he'd highlighted every inconsistency in their governing documents and circled what he called the smoking gavel, the fact that the HOA's current board hadn't followed proper protocol for over 2 years. Not one election had been held since Karen appointed herself president after the last guy moved to Arizona. According to their own rules, her presidency was not only illegitimate, but technically null and void. Every decision she had made since then, including fines, citations, and new restrictions, could be tossed out with one competent legal challenge. Darren's words, not mine. He made copies of everything, formatted it like a brief, and tucked it into a slim binder with a label that read, "Karen vs. Common Sense." It was funny, but it also felt like a declaration of war. I spent the day gathering neighbor testimony. I knocked on doors, not to stir trouble, but to ask questions. Did they know about Karen's emergency meetings? Had they been invited? Had they ever voted on new regulations? The answers were almost always the same: confused looks, awkward pauses, and finally a quiet, "Wait, no. I don't think we ever voted on that." That was gold. One neighbor, old Mr. Pennington, told me he used to serve on the board before Karen took over everything. He remembered bylaws being changed at her kitchen table without the required 5-member vote. "She just told us it was time-sensitive and bulldozed it through," he said, shaking his head. Back then, I thought she was just being efficient. Now I'm starting to wonder. Darren and I compiled all this into what we called our HOA audit packet. Every inconsistency, every bylaw breach, every skipped election and phantom quorum. But we knew that just confronting Karen wouldn't work. She thrived on noise, chaos, and confrontation. So we went another route. We filed a formal complaint to the county's Housing and Neighborhood Compliance Board. Quietly, anonymously, Darren made sure the language was precise, unemotional, and supported by citations from their own documents. It was surgical. If Karen was expecting a street fight, she had no idea we'd show up with snipers. While waiting for the county to respond, Darren also reached out to an old college friend who happened to be a freelance investigative journalist. She had a particular interest in HOAs gone rogue and had published a viral series 2 years earlier called Boardroom Bullies. When Darren told her about the Treehouse and Karen's campaign against it, she was immediately intrigued. "Sounds like another small-town Napoleon with a badge and a clipboard," she said. Within 2 days, she drove into town with a notepad, camera, and a hunger for scandal. We didn't even have to tell her much. Once she started asking questions, the stories poured in. One family claimed Karen fined them for putting a trampoline in their yard, even though the bylaws had no trampoline restriction. Another swore Karen entered their backyard without permission to inspect a suspicious shed. One woman said Karen tried to penalize her for planting tomatoes in her front garden, citing a non-existent, decorative plant-only policy. It was like a greatest hits compilation of petty power abuse. The journalist, whose name was Erica, dug into the HOA's financial records next. She requested annual budgets, dues collection statements, and contractor invoices. The board, of course, resisted at first, claiming confidentiality. But when Erica mentioned the words Freedom of Information Request and Feature Story, the doors opened faster than you could say public embarrassment. What she found was even better than we imagined. Karen had approved spending on mysterious board retreats, high-end office furniture, and repeated consulting fees to a company that didn't even have a working website. Erica looked up from her laptop and said, "I think this lady might be stealing from her own neighbors." It was around this time that Karen started to panic. She showed up on our doorstep again, this time without the clipboard or the smug grin. She tried to play it nice, said she might have overreacted, and that maybe the treehouse could be grandfathered in after all. She even said her threat to sue was just a scare tactic. That's when I realized she wasn't just worried about the treehouse, she was scared about what we were going to do next. I thanked her politely and said we were still considering our options. She left with a fake smile that barely held its shape. But 2 hours later, every mailbox on the block got another flyer, this time accusing certain residents of trying to undermine the authority of the HOA and destabilize the safety of the neighborhood. She didn't name us, but the hint was about as subtle as a brick through a window. That's when we knew she wasn't going to back down quietly. Darren called a local attorney who specialized in HOA litigation, not because we needed him yet, but because we wanted someone in our corner in case things escalated further. The lawyer reviewed everything we had and whistled when he finished. "This is not just grounds for removal. If what you've shown me is accurate, this could end with criminal charges." That wasn't our goal, but we weren't going to stop the train once it started moving. Meanwhile, Erica continued digging and finally confronted Karen outside the HOA office, camera rolling. Karen tried to shield her face, then accused Erica of harassment, and then stormed off in her car, knocking over a sprinkler on the way out. That footage didn't just go in Erica's report, it went viral within hours after she posted a teaser clip online with the title, "HOA President Melts Down Over Treehouse." Suddenly, the story wasn't just local. And right on schedule, the county board called us. They were launching a formal inquiry into the HOA's governance practices. An inspector would be arriving the following week. Karen's empire, built on silence and intimidation, was beginning to collapse brick by brick. The treehouse still stood tall in our backyard. Lily had drawn a sign that read, "The Fort of Justice," and hung it with string. We hadn't taken it down, and now we knew we never would. What began as a gift for our daughter was becoming something else, a symbol, not just of childhood joy, but of what happens when you stand up to a bully with a clipboard and expose the cracks in their little kingdom. And something told me we were only getting started. The lawsuit came exactly 2 days after the county announced their investigation. It was almost like Karen knew the walls were closing in and decided to launch a last-ditch missile in hopes of distracting everyone from the fire already spreading in her office. The envelope arrived via courier, hand-delivered to our front door like it was some kind of royal proclamation. I opened it, skimmed the pages, and immediately burst out laughing. Darren didn't laugh. He read the whole thing in complete silence, then carefully set it down, looked up at me, and said, "Well, she just handed us the win. Karen's civil complaint accused us of creating a public hazard, violating aesthetic standards, diminishing the property value of the neighborhood, and, in a laughable stretch, contributing to emotional distress for other homeowners. It was riddled with exaggerations, half-truths, and even a few outright lies, like the claim that our treehouse had bright strobe lights and blared music past midnight, which was physically impossible since the treehouse didn't have speakers, or electricity for that matter. But the cherry on top was when she included a handwritten list of names she claimed supported her. Darren cross-referenced those names with meeting sign-in sheets and found that half of them hadn't attended a single meeting in over a year. We didn't panic. We didn't yell. We just got to work. Darren called in a favor from his former mentor, a brilliant attorney named Marissa Cole, who now specialized in civil litigation and HOA corruption. Marissa wasn't just sharp, she was brutal in the courtroom, famous for dismantling smug HOA presidents with the efficiency of a woodchipper. She owed Darren a favor from clerking days, and when she heard what was going on, she said, "I've been waiting for someone like this, Karen. I'm in." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Marissa came over with a legal assistant and a thick folder of motions and exhibit. She wanted to countersue, not just to defend us, but to expose Karen's abuse of power, misappropriation of HOA funds, and the systemic violations she had committed since assuming power. It was bold, aggressive, and exactly what we needed. Darren helped craft the legal argument, citing obscure housing laws and constitutional principles like it was second nature. It was honestly kind of thrilling to watch them work. Two legal titans building a case not just to win, but to set something right. When the court date arrived, it was standing room only. Word had spread like wildfire. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, reporters, and even a few law students who'd heard about the Treehouse trial from Erica's viral article. Karen showed up in a navy pantsuit, carrying a thick binder and a smile that looked duct-taped to her face. Her attorney, a man who looked like he was regretting every life choice that brought him to this moment, whispered something to her, but she waved him off and strutted to the plaintiff's table like she owned the building. We sat quietly. Marissa did most of the talking, and when the judge called the court to order, she stood with that calm, razor-sharp confidence that made everyone lean forward just a little. Karen's lawyer led with a long, winding statement about community standards and residential harmony. He tried to paint us as reckless homeowners, hell-bent on disrupting the peace. He even tried to argue that the treehouse was a safety risk to children who might be tempted to climb it unsupervised, despite the fact that it was built with a locking ladder gate and clearly posted rules. It was desperate and flimsy. Then Marissa stood, walked to the center of the room, and delivered what I can only describe as a legal evisceration. She presented photographs, construction permits, expert statements from the builder, and evidence of the treehouse's structural integrity. She exposed the lack of due process in Karen's leadership, pointed out that the bylaws had not been followed for 2 years, and even introduced HOA financial records obtained through the Freedom of Information request. Records that showed tens of thousands of dollars spent under Karen's authority with no documentation or approval vote. Then came the coup de grace. Marissa pulled out a printout of Erica's article and stated, "This story includes testimony from no less than 7 residents who were improperly fined, harassed, or misled by the plaintiff." Karen objected, of course, saying the article was hearsay, but the judge overruled it, noting that sworn affidavits were attached. The entire courtroom felt like it was leaning in for the verdict. Karen tried to speak. She insisted she was only doing what was best for the community, that her intentions were pure, and that she'd never wanted this to become hostile. The judge raised a hand and asked one simple question. "Can you show documentation where the HOA voted to approve any of the policies you've enforced since 2022? Karen stuttered, looked through her binder, and then admitted that no, she didn't have that documentation on hand. The judge stared at her for a long moment before saying, "Then it seems we have a serious governance issue on top of a misdirected lawsuit." The ruling came 2 hours later. The court dismissed the HOA's case with prejudice, citing lack of standing and abuse of process. Our countersuit was cleared to proceed, and the judge issued a preliminary injunction blocking the HOA from issuing any new fines, sanctions, or rule changes until the county's investigation concluded. Karen's face turned the color of spoiled yogurt. But it wasn't over. The very next morning, Erica published a follow-up article titled, "The Treehouse That Toppled a Tyrant." It included new revelations. Emails from Karen to the HOA board pushing through private expenses, including catered lunches, spa reimbursements, and a conference trip to Las Vegas that coincided with a Taylor Swift concert. The receipts were all there, and the fallout was immediate. The article was picked up by a national site. Local radio hosts mocked it. Memes exploded. Someone even photoshopped Karen's face onto the Wicked Witch of the West with a treehouse falling on her. Karen tried to contain the damage, issuing a statement through the HOA's Facebook page calling everything a coordinated smear campaign by disgruntled residents. But it was too late. The community that once tolerated her out of fear now saw her as a fraud with a vendetta. Meanwhile, our daughter Lily hung a banner from the treehouse that said, "We won." Kids came by to play again. Parents smiled as they walked past. The house felt lighter, the air cleaner. For the first time in a long time, our backyard didn't feel like a battleground, it felt like home. Darren and I sat on the deck that night, watching Lily swing from the zipline, her laughter echoing in the air. I turned to him and asked, "Do you think it's really over?" He smiled and said, "Not yet." But the tides turned. She made the mistake of trying to play judge. Now she'll learn what happens when the law answers back. And in the distance, Karen's carefully constructed empire of rules, fines, and fabricated authority began to crumble like a sandcastle in high tide. The days that followed felt like the slow unraveling of a decades-old carpet, revealing just how much dirt had been swept underneath it. Karen had always carried herself like the queen of the neighborhood, but now her royal court was in full retreat. Board members who once stood proudly behind her began resigning without a word. Notices were quietly removed from the community bulletin board, and the HOA newsletter that used to arrive like clockwork was nowhere to be found. But the silence was louder than anything Karen had ever shouted through her megaphone of power. She wasn't just losing control, she was losing the very illusion of it. The court's injunction had stripped Karen of her ability to impose any new rules, which meant no more fines, no more surprise inspections, and no more last-minute policy changes disguised as safety measures. Her influence was evaporating in real time, and the only thing holding the HOA together was the string of fear she had knotted over the years. Once that snapped, the whole thing came tumbling down. And it did beautifully. The County Compliance Board began their formal audit. Investigators showed up with clipboards and neutral expressions, taking photos, recording interviews, and collecting boxes of old HOA record. They weren't interested in Karen's excuses, only in facts. And the facts weren't kind to her. Neighbors began speaking more freely. At first it was just in whispers, cautiously checking over their shoulders. But soon it became backyard conversations, group texts, and then full-on public discussions at the local coffee shop. People were tired of living under HOA rule that felt less like a homeowners organization and more like a personal empire. Stories surfaced about fines for having holiday lights up a day too long, threats for children drawing chalk on sidewalks, and even someone being written up for their lawn furniture being the wrong shade of beige. One neighbor said Karen had once threatened to call animal control because their dog barked during her meditation hours. It was absurd, but the worst part was how normal it had all become under her reign. Darren and I didn't gloat, not publicly. We knew it was better to let the facts do the talking. But we did keep moving forward. With Marissa still representing us, we pushed forward with the countersuit. Not because we wanted money, but because the community deserved to see the full extent of what Karen had done. If we settled, it would disappear quietly. But if we pursued it, we could force transparency. Discovery was brutal. Her personal purchases using HOA funds added up to over $40,000. Spa treatments labeled as board wellness, first-class flights listed under conference travel, and even a bizarre expense labeled retreat snacks that was actually for a catered dinner at her niece's birthday. Darren kept every receipt. When Marissa filed the financial misconduct claims as part of the civil suit, the county attorney's office took notice. That's when everything shifted from petty neighborhood drama to something criminal. Karen's behavior wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. She'd mixed personal and HOA funds, created fake vendor invoices, and approved her own reimbursements with no co-signature. The audit confirmed it. The compliance board referred the case to the district attorney, and Karen received a letter informing her that a formal investigation into financial mismanagement had been opened. The community buzzed like a live wire. People stopped asking if she'd be removed and started wondering when she'd be arrested. Karen went into full spin mode. She hosted a last-minute community meeting at the clubhouse, trying to sway public opinion. She showed up with cookies, soft jazz playing in the background, and a PowerPoint presentation titled Restoring Trust. The irony was so thick I almost choked on it. She tried to frame everything as a misunderstanding. She claimed the trips were for training, the spa visits were therapeutic recovery, and the fines she issued were for the good of the neighborhood. But no one was buying it anymore. Her charm had worn thin, and without power behind her words, her voice just sounded desperate. During the Q&A portion, an elderly woman who had lived there since the neighborhood was built raised her hand. She stood slowly and said, "Karen, I supported you for years. I even defended you to my friends. But I looked through the bylaws last night, and I realized I was defending someone who lied to all of us." Karen froze. You could feel the tension snap in the air. That one sentence did more damage than any lawsuit ever could. The room was quiet for a long moment before people began murmuring, some standing and walking out. Karen was left standing in front of her slideshow, the projector humming behind her, alone. The journalist Erica returned to do a follow-up interview. She met with more residents, some of whom had been too afraid to speak the first time. She collected video clips of Karen yelling at people from her front porch, emails with passive-aggressive threats, and screenshots of HOA fines issued without evidence. Her second article was even more brutal than the first. It painted a picture of a neighborhood dictator whose downfall was caused not just by greed, but by arrogance. By the time it was published, the state had picked it up for a broader look into HOA oversight across multiple districts. Meanwhile, the treehouse stood proud and untouched, draped in little decorations from the neighborhood kids who had turned it into a sort of sanctuary. Someone had painted a sign that said, "Free Country Zone," and someone else added a small flag on the roof. The kids didn't care about bylaws. They just saw it as a place where they could be safe, laugh, and feel free. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. That weekend, we hosted a backyard gathering, this time with the full blessing of the neighborhood. Parents brought snacks, someone set up a bubble machine, and a neighbor with a guitar played music while the kids ran wild. Darren gave a small toast, not a speech, just a quiet thank you to everyone who stood up, spoke out, and didn't let fear win. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, it was genuine. That meant more than anything. Before the night ended, a few neighbors asked me if I'd consider running for HOA president once Karen was officially removed. I thanked them, but said no. I didn't want power. I just wanted peace. What I did offer was a draft of a new bylaw proposal Darren and I had worked on. It emphasized transparency, term limits, required community voting, and budget accountability. It wasn't fancy. It was fair. Karen's removal was now inevitable. The board scheduled an emergency vote, this time following every proper protocol. With the evidence stacked against her, and the community no longer silent, it was clear the era of Karen was ending. Not with a dramatic outburst, but with quiet accountability and the kind of justice that doesn't need to shout to be heard. That night, as the lights dimmed and Lily fell asleep in her treehouse after begging to have a sleepover up there, Darren and I sat on the porch swing, listening to the sounds of laughter and wind in the leaves. We didn't speak much. We just held hands and watched the stars, knowing that sometimes, all it takes is one well-built treehouse to shake the roots of power. The vote to remove Karen happened on a rainy Thursday evening, the kind where the sky feels heavy with more than just weather. People came in droves, umbrellas clutched in one hand and ballots in the other. There was no more fear, no more pretending. The clubhouse was packed beyond capacity, and for the first time in years, the HOA meeting actually felt like a community event instead of a courtroom where one woman passed sentence. Karen arrived late, wearing a gray raincoat and dark glasses, as though hiding her eyes could shield her from the tidal wave of accountability crashing down. No one greeted her. The board chair called the meeting to order and wasted no time. Within minutes, the vote was underway. By the end of the hour, the tally was read aloud, and the result echoed like a gavel through the room. Karen had been officially removed from the HOA board by a landslide vote of 74-6. She didn't say a word. She didn't cry. She just stood up, turned around, and walked out into the rain with her head held high but her shoulders hunched forward, as if the weight of everything she had built was now collapsing inward. No one followed her. No one called out. She was gone, and just like that, the neighborhood exhaled. There was no applause, just a deep, shared silence that felt like the end of a long, painful chapter. And in its place, the first sentence of something new. What followed was swift and measured. An interim board was established, composed of volunteers from various blocks, each one chosen through an open vote. Darren helped them organize their first order of business, an emergency audit of all HOA finances, policies, and procedures. The results were staggering. Karen had funneled thousands more into personal purchases, masked as community upgrades that never materialized. One receipt listed a high-end espresso machine she claimed was for the clubhouse kitchen, even though no one had ever seen it. Another showed payment for emergency landscaping that turned out to be lawn service for her sister's home 2 towns over. The board turned over the evidence to the district attorney, who added it to the ongoing criminal investigation. About 2 weeks later, Karen was officially charged with embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of nonprofit funds. A deputy served her the arrest warrant at her home early one morning, and by noon her mugshot was making the rounds online. It was almost surreal to see her like that. No clipboard, no smirk, just a blank stare that said it all. The news stations picked it up, spinning headlines about the Treehouse scandal and the downfall of a suburban tyrant. But for us, it wasn't about humiliation. It was about justice finally settling into a place where it belonged. The countersuit we'd filed moved forward, and after some negotiation, Karen agreed to settle rather than risk a full trial. The terms required her to pay restitution to the HOA, issue a public apology, and be permanently barred from serving on any board related to community governance in the state. Her assets were seized to cover the repayments, and she was forced to sell her home to avoid additional legal consequences. A moving truck appeared on her street one morning, and within 2 days, she was gone. Just a memory in a place she once ruled. In the aftermath, the neighborhood began to heal. There was laughter again, real laughter, not the kind hushed by fear of being overheard. People started chatting over fences, organizing block parties, and offering to help one another without suspicion. The new board instituted open-door policies, monthly newsletters with transparent budgets, and even a suggestion box outside the clubhouse. The rulebook was rewritten, this time with Darren's help, and included clear limits on authority, regular audits, and most importantly, protections for homeowners against abuse of power. As for the treehouse, it became a symbol of everything we'd fought for. What had started as a gift to our daughter had grown into something much bigger. People began referring to it as the Freedom Fort. Some joked about turning it into a mini-museum, complete with a timeline of events leading up to the Great HOA Revolution. Lily beamed every time someone asked for a tour, proudly pointing out the zipline and showing off the hand-drawn signs her friends had helped her make. It stood tall and proud, a monument not just to play, but to perseverance. The journalist, Erica, visited one final time to do a follow-up for a national outlet. She interviewed neighbors, filmed B-roll of the treehouse at sunset, and asked me one final question that caught me off guard. She said, "If you could go back to the day you built that first ladder rung, would you still do it?" I paused for a long time before answering. I thought about the stress, the anger, the nights we stayed up wondering what would happen next. But I also thought about the change, the pride in our daughter's eyes, the community that came together. So I said, yes. I'd build it bigger. In the weeks that followed, the treehouse became more than just our backyard project. It became a meeting place. Darren hosted a legal literacy workshop up there, teaching neighbors about their rights under HOA law. Kids painted the support beams with chalk murals. One neighbor even installed a small solar light to keep it softly glowing at night. It had become a beacon in more ways than one. Eventually, we received a letter from the State Attorney General's office thanking Darren for his role in helping expose HOA abuse. His quiet expertise and relentless documentation had been essential in helping establish precedent for broader investigations statewide. A month later, he was invited to join a task force aimed at drafting model HOA legislation that could be adopted across the country. I still remember the look on his face when he got the call, surprised, humbled, and a little amused. "All because of a treehouse," he whispered. One quiet evening, I stood in the yard as Lily climbed into her treehouse with her flashlight and sleeping bag, giggling with her friends. The breeze rustled through the trees, and the last golden light of day bathed everything in warmth. Darren joined me on the porch with 2 cups of tea, and we sat in silence for a while. No drama, no noise, just peace. He finally broke the silence and said, "You know, this whole thing started because Karen thought she could scare us into submission." I nodded and replied, "She picked the wrong family." We clinked our mugs together softly, the sound light and certain. The story of the treehouse spread beyond our block, beyond our city. But to us, it wasn't about viral fame or headlines. It was about standing up when it counted. It was about not letting someone else decide what joy looked like in our own backyard. And most of all, it was about showing our daughter what it means to fight, not with fists or fury, but with truth, persistence, and a little help from someone who just happens to work at the Supreme Court. And as the stars blinked on one by one, high above the leaves, I realized that sometimes the smallest structures can hold the tallest victories.